Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video will be about the first reading for part 3 of our book, and the fundamental question for part 3 is, what can I know? So the 4 fundamental questions. We had the first question was, who or what am I? The second question was, what is real? And now, what can I know? So the first reading is a Buddhist text, the Questions of Malunkyaputta, and it's edited by E.J. Thomas. So it starts out with this: the elder Malunkyaputta. So he had retired from the world and become a Buddhist monk, but he was starting to have second thoughts. So he thought to himself, these theories have been left unexplained by the Lord, set aside and rejected. So here's what he has not been told. Whether the world is eternal or not eternal, whether the world is finite or not, whether the soul is the same as the body, or whether the soul is one thing and the body another, whether a Buddha exists after death or does not exist after death, whether a Buddha both exists and does not exist after death, and whether a Buddha is non-existent and not non-existent after death. These things the Lord does not explain to me. If he doesn't explain to me these questions to me, then I'll give up the training and return to a worldly life. So I guess, I don't know how long he'd been practicing the renunciation of a Buddhist monk, but he was getting fed up with it and he wanted some answers. So when he approached the Lord, when he approached Buddha, Buddha said, come, Malunkyaputta. Now, did I, Malunkyaputta, ever say to you, come, Malunkyaputta, lead a religious life with me, and I will explain to you whether the world is eternal or not eternal, and so on with the other questions? So Malunkyaputta said, no, you never said that. So then comes the parable of the arrow. So this is just a one-page reading. And Buddha said to his disgruntled disciple, if you won't lead a religious life until you get these questions answered, it would be like a man who had been wounded by an arrow, thickly smeared with poison, and his friends, companions, relatives, and kinsmen were to get a surgeon to heal him, and he were to say, I will not have this arrow pulled out until I know by what man I was wounded, whether he is of the warrior caste, or a Brahmin, or of the agricultural, or the lower caste. And he goes on with the analogy, whether the string comes from, what's the bow made out of? Is it bamboo or hemp or a milksap tree? Where do the feathers on the arrow come from? What kind of a bird? Is it a peacock? Or so he goes on with all the, what's the arrow made out of? All these different things. So the point of the story is, if you're dying of poison that's going through your body, just remove the poison and you can ask those questions later. But to waste your time asking all those unimportant questions is to, meanwhile, let the poison kill you. So, the second paragraph on page 250, Buddha says, it is not on the view that the world is eternal, Malunkyaputta, that a religious life depends, and so on with the other questions. He says, whether those questions are answered or not, there is still rebirth, there is old age, there is death and grief, lamentation, suffering, sorrow, and despair, the destruction of which even in this life I announce. So whether the world is eternal, I have not explained. Whether the world is not eternal, I didn't explain any things. Why? Because it's not useful. It's not concerned with the principles of a religious life, and it does not conduce to aversion, absence of passion, cessation, tranquility, supernatural faculty, perfect knowledge, nirvana, and therefore I have not explained it. So one point I'll point out here is, he says, whether there's a soul that's separate from the body and the world's eternal or not, he says, there is still rebirth, there's still old age, there's still death. Well, if you say there's rebirth, that's answering one of those questions that he said he wouldn't answer, which is there life after death? You know, although that's complicated by the Buddhist doctrine of anatman, no self. So they do believe in reincarnation, but what's reincarnating isn't an eternal self. It's not an eternal soul. It's kind of just the habits carry them. The karma carries itself from one body to the next, and when you realize that you don't exist as an individual, that continuous whirlwind of karmic reactions just stops, and the suffering stops. So the Buddhist philosophy is desire creates suffering. So if you don't want to suffer, you have to stop desiring things, and that is what Buddha taught. So the bottom paragraph, page 250, and what Malunkyaputta have I explained? Suffering have I explained, the cause of suffering, the destruction of suffering, and the path that leads to the destruction of suffering have I explained. Those are called the Four Noble Truths, which we'll see in part 4 of the book. For this, Malunkyaputta is useful. This is concerned with the principle of a religious life. This conduces to aversion, absence of passion, cessation, tranquility, supernatural faculty, perfect knowledge, nirvana, and therefore I have explained it. So Malunkyaputta was satisfied with that, and he applauded the words of the Lord. So let's go to these discussion questions. Number 1 on page 251. Explain how the parable of the arrow is supposed to work. Well, we already went over that. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I think it would be important to just point out the parallels between the parable of the arrow and Buddha's philosophy. So the key thing is what is the parallel of the poison on the arrow. So the arrow is thickly smeared with poison, and somebody gets shot with this arrow, and the poison starts to go through their body. What is that comparable to? It's not explicitly spelled out here, but you can pretty much understand the cause of suffering is not pointed out, but what a religious life should consist of is pointed out, and it conduces to aversion, absence of passion, cessation, tranquility. So to quell the desires that cause suffering, that is a religious life. How do you cultivate this aversion to desires and giving in to them? Just because that's when Buddha said to Malunkyaputta, suffering have I explained, the cause of suffering, destruction of suffering, the path that leads to destruction of suffering. So the cause of suffering is desire. And whether you know if there's a soul that's separate from the body, if the world's eternal or not, and all those other questions, Buddha is saying that won't help you cultivate this spirit of a tranquil mind that has no desires. So that's how the parable of the arrow is supposed to work. Just remove the poisoned arrow, remove the desires from your mind. And some of these desires are, Malunkyaputta has this desire to have this knowledge. So that's just one more desire that's causing him stress. And Buddha is saying, don't worry about those questions. Just follow what I have taught you and cultivate this tranquil spirit of renunciation. Okay, so discussion question 2. How often do you think we are like Malunkyaputta? Why? Explain. So how often do we get paralyzed with indecision because we think we need more information about some topic before we can act with confidence? It's a pretty open-ended question. If it does appear on the exam, just link it to something directly from this small one-page text. So discussion question 3, Malunkyaputta applauds at the end. Why do you think he might have been convinced by the parable? Explain. Well, now you've got to psychoanalyze Malunkyaputta here. Let me turn off this volume. So why might he have been convinced by the parable? I really don't know why he would have been convinced. I personally would not have been convinced, because I do think that you can have at least some plausible answers to these kinds of questions. And I would furthermore say to Buddha, well, you know, you want me to renounce bodily desires. It would help me do that if I thought maybe there's some eternal world where I could go to, as opposed to just disintegrating my sense of individuality. You're offering me no more pain, but at the same time, no more personal existence, which I don't find appealing, but I can understand if you assume personal existence automatically and always equals suffering, how you would want to get rid of it. But why would Malunkyaputta applaud it? I mean, there is some plausibility to what he's saying. Why are you exercising your mind on these questions? How do you propose to prove whether anyone is right or wrong? And in the absence of any real trustworthy way of believing an answer, it's maybe better to just leave those questions alone, because they're just going to trouble your mind endlessly, because no one can really 100% guarantee you the knowledge. I think if that was your opinion, how you might find Buddha's advice to be worthy of applause. So, but whatever your interpretation of why Malunkyaputta might applaud at the end, all I'll be grading on is your knowledge of the text. If your opinion is supported by clear knowledge of the text, then it is going to get full credit. Okay, so the next video will be about the writings of Zhuangzi, and that's a hard one to pronounce. I went on pronunciation.com. There's a bunch of different ways, but it's a Taoist text, and we will pick up with that.